Welcome to the Making of Me podcast, where we explore the defining moment that shape ordinary people into who they'll become. Our today's guest is Clifford Brown, our former on-set mission director, Anthony, author, and one of the most quietly extraordinary public servants you have probably never heard of. Clifford gave up a partnership at the Beverly Hill law firm, his dream home, and most of his income in 1987 to take up a job in foreign aid. That single decision sent him across 27 years and dozens of countries across military coup in Haiti, Guinea, and Congo, and the tulip revolution of Kyrgyzstan, civil chaos in Nicaragua and Honduras, and the front line of plain Colombia. His own wife was adopted in Kyrgyzstan in an attempt to force him out of the country for speaking out against the corruption. He has seen the best of what America can offer the world and watch it get dismantled. His book is The Inside on Set, the Odyssey of Foreign Assistance. Yeah, Clifford, it's really a pleasure and honor to have you on the show.
Well, Benaiah, thank you for the opportunity. I'm happy to talk to you all. As you may know, I've spent 5.5 years of my life living in Africa, and it's a place I'm very fond of. Yes, I was 3.5 years on the east side in Nairobi, where I was lucky enough to learn Swahili, and then I spent 2 years on the west side. But when I was in Nairobi, my job was regional, so I traveled all over. I got to Kinshasa, Libya, and I don't know. I'm very fond of the continent, and I'm a longtime fan of the potential that's there. It's an incredible place.
Yeah, amazing. Thank you so much. So, Clifford, before the onset, before the law firm, who were you and what did growing up on the Columbia River in eastern Washington, working on the farm and tugboat and research vessels, put in you that never left?
You know, it was, I grew up in a lower middle class family. My father was an electrician, and I worked on farms during the summer. He made us work. And one of my jobs one summer was on a tugboat, and that tugboat pulled up underneath the bow of a very large ocean going barge. And I looked at that bow and I said, wow, that ship has been places that I've never come close to. I would love to have that. And so later, I ended up working on an oceanographic boat that left the port of Seattle, and it traveled down to Tahiti, and then it did some scientific studies. I was just a dishwasher initially on the ship, and later I became a typist to work in the office. But the ship then came up the coast of South America, and we had one guy that was fluent in Spanish, and I was so impressed. He was jabbering away in both English and Spanish with these people, and I had tried to study foreign languages and failed miserably because I didn't know. The secret is that you really have to work at it at first, and if you're an adult, children don't have to. But I was determined when I got back to school to really learn a foreign language. So I studied Spanish my last year in college. Then I won a fellowship. I got a fellowship to go back to Latin America. And the idea was I was going to go work on farms in Latin America, which was a dumb idea because it was illegal for me to do that in those countries. I had a tourist visa. I wasn't supposed to work. But a bigger obstacle is the fact nobody can understand why. Why would you want to do that? You've got a college degree. Why do you want to come work on our farm? And so I ended up going down to Chile. I lived with I had a cousin who had been in the Peace Corps there, and I lived with his father-in-law. He was long gone by then, but I lived with his father-in-law, and the man, he was a retired medical doctor. He didn't speak a word of English, and he and his housekeeper, they were the people that really taught me to use Spanish. I'd already studied it academically, but I began to use it. And by the time I got back, I went to law school after that, which is a whole different story. But by the time I got back, I was fluent in Spanish. And when you start to use another language, it's almost like you grew another soul.
Yeah.
You feel like another person. And I always wanted to use it in my work. So I was practicing commercial law for about 12 years in Los Angeles, and I was young enough to be stupid enough to think, well, I've got enough money now. I can go do something else. And at the time, I only had 2 kids. Now I got 5, but I didn't know better. A big case ended. I was reading a newspaper and I saw an ad that my agency, USAID, I'd never heard of it. The USAID stands for United States Agency for International Development. And they used to leave off the US part and they just called it AID. which was it was a cute pun. It means, it doesn't mean aid in the sense of assistance. What it means is Agency for International Development. I didn't know what it was, but I went back to DC and I interviewed, and they had a big map on the wall. And all over the map were these little, it was a whole world map, and they had these little red pins. I asked him what those were, and he said, that's where our attorneys are. And something in me said, I got to have this job. So I took it. And
Yeah.
of course, because I spoke Spanish, they sent me to Nairobi,
Yeah.
which made no sense at all. But after 3 years there, I was traveling all over. It was a regional job. I had to travel with the different missions, and I did not get West Africa during that experience, apart from Kinshasa. Which in those days it was still Zaire. It wasn't the DRC it is now. But Kinshasa and Windhoek in Namibia were as far west as I got. But then about 20 years later, I returned and became the mission director in Guinea for both Guinea and Sierra Leone. And I traveled quite a bit around West Africa at that point. But, I did give up a career in law, but I didn't regret it. It was a fascinating experience. I got to live in a total of 8 different countries, and I got to learn. They sent me back to school to learn French and Russian,
Hmm.
and I ended up marrying my Russian teacher. So she's still my teacher. I had phenomenal experiences in the Foreign Service. The downside was I didn't put down roots, and so now in my old age, my roots are basically the people I met in my career, and
Yeah.
they're scattered all over the world. And I have 2 older children that are they themselves. I barely see them because one lives in South America, the other lives in Europe. So I'm telling my current family kids, I got 2 girls that are about to turn 12. They were born in Peru, and I have a boy who's 19. He's in college, and I'm telling them, you can go anywhere you want as long as I can drive there in an
Yeah.
hour. I
Yeah.
don't want to.
Amazing, amazing, amazing. So at the point where you actually get to kind of leave your law firm towards taking up that particular role, so what did people around you say when you told them you were leaving for the foreign aid?
Well, when I had to go back from DC and explain to my wife that I wanted to take this job, that was that was a long discussion. What she said was, "Well, you go try it and see if you like it, and if you do, then maybe the kids and I will come."
Hmm.
And I did try it, and I did like it, and they did come. But it was for a while we were separated. But when they got to Nairobi, I had 2 young kids there, and they loved it. They thought
Hmm.
it, in fact, upset when we had to leave. They went to an international school there, the International School of Kenya, and they had many friends from all over the world. And we had a great time in Kenya. We went to all the game parks. We used to go down to Mombasa and go swimming there in the Indian Ocean, and it was a lot of fun. When I was home, I mean, most of the time I was on the road, but when I was home, we had a great time.
Yeah, amazing. It's really lovely. Just hearing you like share the experience from telling your wife to she give you the permission and coming around to join you. It's really fascinating. And also, you have lived through the military corps, civil chaos, and the political upheaval across multiple countries. What does witnessing those kind of societal fragility do to a person, and what does it change about how you see stability and what holds society together?
Well, that's a great question, and frankly, I tell people that chaos seemed to follow me around. I had to go down to Haiti the week after the military government had called out soldiers, and they literally shot people as they were
Oh.
standing in line. And I had to go down there to tell the contractors that, look, the job's over. We're terminating assistance to this government, and it was a real eye opener to see how fast a country could fall apart. Then I was in Guatemala the very day that the president ordered the army to surround this Congress and the Supreme Court, and they arrested the justices on the Supreme Court and the congressman. Now that didn't last. It only because our State Department informed them that if the military let them stand, that they were not going to be doing business with us anymore. And the military there, of course, they made so much money controlling some of the imports and export businesses that they decided this is serious. We got to tell this president he's crazy, and they kicked him out of the country. Then I was in I was in Kyrgyzstan, and I was actually the number 2 person in the embassy. The real guy was on vacation, so the ambassador asked me to be his deputy that day for that week. And then during that week, the whole place fell apart. There were demonstrations in front of the presidential palace. The president got in a helicopter and fled the country, and the police disappeared, and young bands of men went around the city, breaking into all the shops, and it was just pure chaos, and the place has never been the same. And then I was in Guinea the day that Lassana Conte died, and he had been their president for over 20 years, and then factions within the military started fighting each other. That, and also the experience of living in the former Soviet Union, which, as you may recall, fell apart in a rather short period of time. The entire former Soviet Union was, in a matter of a week or two, gone. And although we applauded it in the West because of this false dichotomy, I call it, between the two sides of the Cold War, the truth is that every society can fall apart quickly if the social consensus disappears, and I fear that may be happening here in this country now. And you see symptoms of it everywhere. Partly, I think, because of all the social media and everything that's kind of divided the world into subcultures. We can choose among so many different sources of information now that people tend to gravitate and coalesce around various ideas, and there's so many of them out there that you don't have the kind of social consensus that we used to have, in part because religion has lost a lot of its appeal to many people, in part because, as I say, the social media has made so many other options available. We don't have, at least in our country, we don't no longer have 3 or 4 dominant media companies that you kind of feed everybody
Yeah.
the same line. And there's just so much variety now that you don't have the homogeneity in cultural ideas that we used to have. So I fear that, the problem's getting worse. You see what Britain just now elected their 7th prime minister in as many years, and you see these kind of divisions now in all over the world, with the exception of perhaps China these days, but it's happening everywhere, and it's troubling. What I've come to believe is that these national borders that we have are now probably more of a problem than a solution, because what they have done is enable vast militaries to respond to the whims of a single person. And if that person exercises some poor judgment, as may have happened in the case of Ukraine and might be happening right now, in the case of Iran, it could happen in the case of Taiwan. If you didn't have these vast areas surrounded by a single border, you would not have such crazy, powerful militaries, and that would respond to the whims of a single person. So I'm now a fan of. I realize it's politically a pipe dream, but I'm pushing it for the idea that people start discussing national borders in the way that they used to talk about monarchy
Hmm.
as a habit. I think these borders are simply habits now that we've gotten used to, and we need to question that habit. I don't think they're doing as much good as they used to.
Yeah, amazing. Oh, a whole lot of things to get busy in here. And the fact that, yeah, in society, yeah, the society can actually fall when the society concessions are not in place. And owing to the homogeneity of the news medias and everything, people have different ideas. And yeah, it's really a whole lot. And it just speaks volumes to the chaos now. It's even more owing to a whole lot of variety from different in here and there. And also, your wife was adopted in Kyrgyzstan at a direct attempt to silence you from speaking out against a high level of corruption. What happened and what did that moment demand of you as an husband, an officer, and as a person?
Well, I spell it out in the book. We were getting ready for the Marine Ball. Every year they have a big dance and a party in every American embassy. It's the birthday of the Marines, and all the embassies have Marine guards, so it's a tradition. They put on this big ball. And for me, it was sort of a command performance. I had to go because I was the head of our agency, so I had to show up. And she was out getting ready for it and trying to get her hair done. And I thought she was buying shoes or something. I didn't know what she was doing. But anyway, I get a phone call saying I had an accident. And I said, "What do you mean you had an accident?" She says, "Call Jared." He was the security officer at the embassy. And it turned out that she came out of a hairdresser and three young boys jumped. She got in our car, and then three boys with guns jumped in the back seat and they drove her out of town. And they said, "We're not going to hurt you, elder sister, but your husband owes our boss money." Well, I should start this by saying that my wife was Kyrgyz. Was a local citizen. She was my Russian tutor, and I married her. And I had been interviewed the week before on the national television in Russian, and I disclosed that I had married a local woman. Also, as background to this, I knew a lot about high-level corruption in the energy sector because the easiest thing to smuggle in the world is electricity. And Kyrgyzstan is a very mountainous part of the former Soviet Union, and it has a lot of hydroelectric power. And it's also a very poor country because, in part, in those days, because a lot of that electricity was being smuggled through wire. Nobody can see it. And it goes north to a country, Kazakhstan and Russia, where there's a lot of money because of the oil. And people were paying Kyrgyz officials to smuggle this energy north. In other words, to not meter it. And partly that's because it was so easy to do, because when the former Soviet Union broke up, they didn't have borders. They just announced to these various republics in Central Asia, "Merry Christmas, you're independent." And they didn't believe it. They didn't they didn't ask for it, but all of a sudden they find themselves independent. And then it took several years before they even set up border posts and whatnot. And it took even longer before they started metering the electricity at the border so they could tell how much was leaving the country and negotiate payment for it. But because I knew so much about it, and because some of the very senior people in the government were implicated, my theory is that the government wanted me out, and the easiest way to do that was to scare the heck out of me by abducting my wife. That night, they tied her up and they put her in a small irrigation ditch, and a little boy with a cow, she could see the boy coming through the weeds. I mean, she could look out through the irrigation ditch. It was a dry irrigation ditch, and she could see through the weeds, and the boy was driving a cow with a stick, and she hollered at him, and he came over and untied her feet. He could not untie her hands, but she walked toward town. She came across some strawberry pickers. They had a cell phone. She called me, and we didn't go to the Marine Ball that night. We spent the entire night in police stations, and then the embassy said, "You got to get out of here. It's not safe for you." So they took me to Almaty along with her, and she was pregnant with our son. He's now 19. He's the one in college.
Yeah.
And we were safe for the time being, but we were not allowed to go back. And 15 months later, my stuff came to Conakry, Guinea, and I wasn't able to pack out my own stuff. I had to rely on the embassy to pack us out, but they got us out of the country rather quickly, simply because they didn't think it was safe for me to stay there. So, it's did it silence me? Yes, because I was gone.
Yeah, yeah. Oh, wow, wow. Really, really a whole lot. And also, you walk across Latin America, Central Asia, and Africa, learning Spanish, French, Russian along the way up. What did that kind of deep immersion in other people's culture and language do to your understanding of America and its place in the world?
Well, as I'm telling people now, we're all much more alike than we think, and I was able to get to know so many different cultures, and I was lucky to be able to learn the languages in the places I served, to the point where I had very close friends in each of those countries. And that's why I say now I think that I know that we're all much more alike. And one of the things I tell people, there was an ancient Chinese philosopher named Mencius who said, "There isn't an adult human being on earth that if they see a child about to fall into a well, they want to rush and save that child." It's a very natural thing. And it doesn't matter what race that child is. It doesn't matter what border he's on the other side of. We all feel it, and I know that. I felt it myself, and I was very privileged and lucky to be able to work in foreign aid. I won't say that it changed my understanding of America much. It what it did was give me an appreciation for how common we all, how alike we are everywhere. People have the same desires, the same ambitions, and I view national borders now as a problem because they interfere with not just trade, but with free immigration and a lot of other things, free exchange of ideas. Some of that is being solved now. The language differences are being solved by artificial intelligence. The translation capabilities are really amazing now on some of the software that we have. So if linguistic barriers and also technology is uniting the 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 globe in a way that it's never been able to do before, so perhaps we will start to realize that the physical barriers we've set up are impeding
Hmm.
the exchange of ideas, because ideas, the the phrase that became popular here is that ideas have sex with each other,
Yeah.
and that's how productivity happens. And start putting physical barriers on maps so that those ideas cannot relate to each other and learn from each other, then you're restricting human productivity.
Yeah, amazing, amazing. We are much more alike, yeah, than you think. And idea have sex with each other, but it bit a whole lot of crazy innovation and a whole lot of things that, yeah, just one separate entity couldn't have created, except they come together and bet something into, yeah, their uniqueness and being alike too. Yeah, amazing. Now, so Onset was dismantled in early 2005, and you described being deeply offended by how it was characterized. What was lost, and what do you want people to understand about the agency actually and what it did?
USAID was the tool that we used to do anything overseas that was not appropriate for a military response and was not something that diplomacy all by itself could solve. So it's a very hard agency to describe precisely because we did so many different things. Of course, people are lamenting now the loss of the humanitarian side of it. We did have a lot of humanitarian programs, feeding programs and public health programs and disaster response programs, and those are the easiest to understand the tragedy of destroying the agency. As for the motives for destroying it, I think it was a political stunt. It was something that this administration did because, or they allowed it to happen because they thought it would gain them some political support from people who misunderstand how much good we did, not just for the countries we helped, but for ourselves as well. If we wanted to, for instance, create entire industries in Central America, I tell this story in the book. We once hired a company to try and grow onions in the mountains of Honduras. And then they shipped a container of onions to Miami to see if they could be sold there at a time when onions were not being harvested in the US. And 10 years later, 500,000 people are earning their living growing onions in Honduras. And we repeated that with strawberries in Guatemala, with cantaloupes in El Salvador, with melons in Honduras and El Salvador, with shrimp farming in the Gulf of Fonseca, with flowers in Costa Rica and Colombia. We were doing that as much for our own benefit as to help those people, because if they have, it doesn't do any country a lot of good to have very poor neighbors right beside them, because a lot of problems will come into your country from those if you have it. If when the Soviet Union fell apart, they wanted us to bring in accountants and lawyers to train people on commercial law systems. So we did that. When environmentalists were worried about the loss of forest habitat in either Brazil or in the DRC in West Africa, our people went down and taught communities the benefits of ecotourism and how to run a small little bed and breakfast beside the forest and how to give tours and what advantages this will have for not only the income of the community, but to preserve the forest. Or in Central America, people were worried about animals having a corridor to run north and south without physical barriers. We were asked to convene the governments to negotiate a whole series of contiguous national parks. When poaching was going on in the game parks in West Africa or South Africa, we brought in assistance to the game wardens and better monitoring equipment and things like that. I mean, the list goes on and on and on, and sometimes it was far more than just humanitarian work. It was improving tax collection systems. It was improving the lobbying efforts of business associations. We also promoted the anti-apartheid movement in South Africa by supporting some of the local NGOs, and we had human rights defenders. We did everything. I mean, it spanned the entire gamut of human activity. And the tragedy of its loss is that we don't have that tool anymore. We shot ourselves in the foot, as far as I'm concerned, and I hope someday it gets reestablished. But the allegation that we were all corrupt and we were skimming that money off the top is just total nonsense. I mean, complete, utter nonsense. So many of the people came from the Peace Corps. They could have made a lot more money in the private sector. And they wanted to do what we were doing because they felt it was an honorable and useful thing to do. And we had we didn't cook up our programs by ourselves. Everything we did was approved by the Congress, by the White House, by the State Department. And we had a lot of eyeballs watching us, the auditors, internal auditors, external auditors. The idea that we were a bunch of crooks was just insane. That was said by Elon Musk and Donald Trump, but they're wrong. I mean, that's as plain as I can say it. They're dead wrong.
Yeah. Oh, a whole lot of experience in there and a whole lot to actually more like I'll get to unveil. And yeah, I think we just pay for that it's no longer existent. And I hope someday it still comes up again and address a whole lot of issues. So looking back at the lawyer who walked away from Beverly Hill in 1987, what are you most grateful for about the decision because of the man and the witness that's made you?
I think it gave me a breadth of experiences that I never would have had I continued to practice law, and I don't regret doing it. That's not to say that I didn't look back. It took me a long time to stop looking back and wondering what life would have been like, but I don't know. It was in my heart then to take a job where I could both use my Spanish, where I could see the world. The downside is that, as I may have said that before, that I don't have the roots that a lot of people have when they've had an entire career in one place. I
Yeah.
think there are good parts and bad parts to doing what I did. I followed my heart's desire at the time, and I don't regret doing it. But then, what good would that do if I did regret it?
Yeah.
So
Yeah, such a amazing, amazing. So you conclude the book with reflections on national borders and spirituality at what you call the lowest point in human society. What are you actually saying, and what do you believe is a stake if we cannot find a way back to something larger than self-interest?
well, first of all, I am impressed that you've done your homework to the point where you've got that far in the book and remember that line.
Thank you.
I do believe that the world today desperately needs a new spiritual leader with charisma of some sort. I don't know who or what or if that will happen, but we are not as unified as we once were in a spiritual sense. But when when most of Western Europe was, either Catholic or later both Catholic and Protestant, the world had a much more, at least that part of the world had a much more cohesive social fabric than it has now. And likewise in the Islamic world, during its heyday, there was a much more cohesive social fabric. And in the East, there was Buddhism that tied together so many different societies there. We have now worshiped materialism to the point where religion has lost its appeal to so many people, or it's being used in ways that don't help. I mean,
Yeah.
when they start regarding a given faith starts to regard believers of a different faith as their enemies, then that's not helping anything. So I make that point at the end of the book. It ties into my belief that these borders are no longer helping. I would welcome any spiritual leader that could appear with enough charisma to attract a following to the point where we could unify the social fabric of not just our country, but the entire world. And I don't see it happening in my lifetime. I hope I'm wrong, but I'm an old man at this point, and
Yeah.
I'm aware of what I've seen, and I worry about what could happen. But call that my prayer that we will at some point find a message that will unify us to a much greater degree than we've been able to do so far.
Yeah, amazing. We need something larger than man. Yeah, that would actually more like have a focus on other than self-interest, which at the end of the day is more detrimental to, yeah, a whole lot of stuff. And yeah, thank you so much for sharing your heart with us on the making of me. And also, you write about our sex trafficking, body part trafficking, and bride kidnapping as reality you encounter firsthand. What do you want people in comfortable country to understand about how prevalent and how brutal this practice here?
You know, it's a hard subject to talk about. Not nearly as ethereal as the last question, but
Yeah.
I did come. I came face to face with some
Hmm.
very practices, and I talk about them in the book. There are freighters, large commercial freighters
Oh.
traveling the globe. Most of the crews on most of these ships are men from Southeast Asia. And during one of the chaotic days in downtown Conakry, when the army was battling itself, our defense attaché officer was in a bar, and two women, one from the Philippines and one from Thailand, came up to him. They did not speak French and they did not speak the local dialect, which was Susu, but they spoke enough English to tell him their story. They were each lured onto these ships by the sailors who were conducting a business on the side to bring these ladies. They tell them they're going to Europe or the States. And in fact, they're brought to the coast in their case, they were brought to Conakry. And the crewmen on these ships had a business that they were turning these ladies into sex slaves.
Oh.
Well, that's enough by itself. Now, let me stop for a minute. There's a lot of construction projects going on in Africa now that are using Chinese labor. The Chinese will fly all of the workers in. They'll set up these cities, and there's a lot of charter airplane flights that go back and forth. The crewmen on these flights, or the workers who go back and forth to visit their families, they also have a side business, just like those sailors have. But
Yeah.
instead of bringing people to West Africa, they're taking body parts back to
Oh.
Asia. And you can infer what that means. Any of these women who object to their fate, they become involuntary. The nice way to put it is they become involuntary organ donors. I saw a video and the trade in the sex trafficking goes both ways. There are African women that are lured on ships to go elsewhere in the Middle East or to Asia because they're considered to be more exotic, I guess. And then there are Asian women that are brought to some of the ports, and it's not just Africa. It happens in the Middle East and the Black Sea region and other places. But anyway, when you combine the sex trafficking of humans with the body parts trafficking, if you go to China these days and you need a new kidney or a new liver, you don't wait. If you got enough money, they've got them available. And where
Oh.
they're getting them, it's either from their own prisoners, the Uyghurs or the Falun Gong, or they're getting these imported body parts. And that's an evil that I became aware of. And I talk a bit about that in the book. I don't want to spend a lot of time here. It's a pretty gruesome topic. As for the bride kidnapping, it's long been a tradition in many parts of Central Asia and I have personally sat in college classrooms listening to young Western dressed women tell me that this is their tradition. The young men, when it's time to get married, will literally go out and kidnap a woman on the street. He might know her already, he might not know her, and they bring the ladies back to the groom's home forcibly. He does this with some of his friends, and we financed a film that actually films this practice. And At the beginning of the film, you see the man, he's getting dressed in his best clothing, and his grandmother's there, and his grandmother's saying, "Don't get a pretty one. I don't want a pretty one. I want one that's going to work." So then he goes out with his buddies in a car, and they pull up behind a school bus, and they literally grab a young girl that's about to get on the school bus, and
Oh,
they drag her back to the car. They put her in the back seat. She's kicking and screaming and saying, "I've got to go to class." And one of them says, "Honey, your school days are over." And they bring her back to the groom's home. She is then surrounded by older women. The old ladies get around this girl and they try to get her to put the scarf on that indicates she submits, then she will become this man's wife. And this, we estimated that some 60% of rural marriages in Kyrgyzstan were happening this way. And as I said, I have sat in college classrooms and I've had young ladies tell me, "We don't date. We don't go on dates. So how else are we going to get married? This is our tradition." I had the young men say the same thing. "This was our tradition." And I said, "Well, slavery used to be a tradition here too. Does that mean it's right?" And it's a pretty hard thing to get your head around, but it's happening. It's real. The film, they got permission. These filmmakers from Eastern Europe. It was the University of Eastern Europe and out of Vienna. They came to town and they got permission from 4 families to film the entire process. And so the 4 families were, you saw the man going out to get his wife, literally take a wife. And then they went back a year later and they interviewed the women. Well, when they got to the 4th one, that woman had committed suicide.
ooh, wow! It's really terrible. Yeah, it's really a whole lot. Hmm.
Yeah, it's a yeah. I don't like to think about it as much as
Yeah,
I did when I was writing the book, but it's in the tale,
wow.
part of the tale. That's why I call it an odyssey of foreign assistance, and that's one of
Yeah, all
the
this.
uh,
Yeah,
chapters is about that phenomenon. It's a collection of different tales. I collected these tales over a period of about 30 years, but I was inspired last year to finally put it into a single place, and, and so my kids
yeah,
can read it. And
amazing.
I,
Thank you. Thank you for all you do. So lastly, what do you hope Inside Onset does to readers who has never thought much about foreign aid, and for the person inside government right now who is wondering whether public service still means something?
well, I think that foreign aid has not disappeared. Our agency, for the time being, is now not. It's been destroyed essentially, and tens of thousands of people are out of their are out of a job because of it. But my hope is that it will be revived at some point, and I know that the aid agencies of other donors are still out there and they're still active, and my hope is that, they will pick up some of the slack and fill in behind us in terms of, especially in terms of the humanitarian work, the disease, the epidemic control. I mean, this Ebola epidemic that started in the DRC now is one example of where we could be doing a lot of good if we still existed, but we don't exist anymore. And I can just only hope that, at the end of our current administration, that USAID will be revived in some fashion. But in the meantime, my heart goes out to all those workers. There were already many more people were employed in the host government than the American. In our case, in Guinea, there were about 4 or 5 Americans, but there were 60 Ghanaians, locals that worked for us. And it was the same way everywhere I was. The local staff was far more numerous. So the real tragedy is not just what happened to our people, it's what happened everywhere we had missions. The local staff is now on the streets. So I wish them luck and I sympathize with them.
Yeah, amazing. Thank you so much. This has really been a whole of eye-opening sections, and thank you so much for sharing your heart with us on the Making of Me podcast. So from our
Well, thank
audience, yeah, thank you, sir. So from our audience, we would love to kind of connect with you, reach out to you either for the book, or to reach out to you maybe after reading the book to for some comments and to message you. And how can they reach out to you, and where is the best platform to connect with you?
Well, I have a web page and it's my name, Clifford, but it has a H. My middle name is Harris, and so the page is cliffordhbrown.com, and perhaps you could put it in show notes. I had to say Clifford H. Brown because there's a much more famous Clifford Brown from America. He was a black trumpet player,
Yeah,
and it's not me, but
yeah.
he If,
Yeah.
if you just Google Clifford Brown, you're going to see a different guy. He died in the 50s in a car crash south of Philadelphia, but that's not me.
Yeah.
cliffordhbrown.com, and you will see links to my Substack. I do some writing now occasionally on Substack, and the book is available on Amazon and Barnes and Noble, some of the platforms and it's published by Mindster Media, but it's available electronically. I think the price now is $2.99 American dollars for
Yeah.
the ebook. So people can find me at that website, cliffordhbrown.com.
Yeah, thank you so much, Oakley, for that. This is really amazing section. Thank you for the conversation as wide as the world you have working. Yeah, your story is a reminder that the most important decisions are really the safe one, and that a life spent in service to something larger than yourself, even when it costs everything, is one of the most extraordinary things a person can choose. From a boy on the Columbia River who got on a research vessel I never quite came back to a man who has spent 27 years showing up in hardship, in hardest place on the earth. You are a proof that foreign aid at its best reflects exactly what we are capable of being. Yeah, it has really been a genuine pleasure and honor having you on the show.
Well, thank you, Bana, for the platform, and I wish you all the best.